Do you ever just look around and ask, how did we get here? How do I hear stories about friends who have kids in this public school system and they have a friend at school who identifies as some kind of animal? How come we had so many libraries that offered drag queen story hours? And it's not just in the kids. Everyone is now questioning whether or not they're proud to be an American or if they even believe in the free market system. So when we're asking, how did we get here? I think a lot of it has to do with the long march through the institutions, something not enough people know about. It's time to spill some sweet tea. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sweet Tea series. My name is Ariana Guajardo. We are talking about the long march through the institutions, and here with me to talk about that is Mandy Drogin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I know that your title has changed since the last time I think you were on the show. You are now the director of...
the Senior Fellow of Government Reform and Oversight Coalition.
Amazing. I know for what we basically at TPPF you need Mandy for is what is our toughest battle, and how can Mandy just go whack it with a bat and knock it out?
Sweet. Yeah.
So you were focused more, well, I guess education is still part of that now. So what does that role look like?
Absolutely. It's education. We're going after that education cartel, the profiteers that are driving up the cost of education, driving up property taxes. You know, we have $552 billion of local property tax debt. 236 billion of that is at the ISD level. So those profiteers who have formed an unholy alliance, if you will, with the far leftist secular Marxists that really have focused on capturing the institutions, particularly our colleges of education and our K-12 system, to radicalize and indoctrinate the next generation of Texans. So that is what we are going after. Both of them are one and the same in terms of being a cartel, and we are going to take them out.
Yep. And they're doing all of that while using your money. So
that's right. Yeah, that is exactly right.
I am so excited for the changes that we're hopefully going to see in the 90th session. But the reason I wanted to have you on the show today is because of a speech you gave. Well, first of all, this was several months ago now at Victory Summit, and it was about walking people through the long march through the institutions, how we got from Marx to here and the strategy that was used. And I realized a few days ago, I kind of just casually mentioned the term long march through the institutions. And multiple people I realized who were my age didn't know what that was or hadn't heard of it before.
Right.
And I grew up with, my dad was obsessed with this one documentary that talked about how that worked, and specifically how it attacked seminaries and the Catholic Church and how that was corrupted through it. So I didn't realize this wasn't something my generation was aware of.
Right.
So first of all, what is the long march through the institutions? Just an overview of where does that term come from? What does it describe?
Well, so it comes from actually the late 1960s, and it was this partnership with the sociologists, the Marxist sociologists, that started at the Frankfurt School in Germany. His name was Herbert Marcuse, and he was a sociologist, and much like Marx and so many other radicals that think that they can get rid of human nature and the sins and the desires that come along with that. And when they were trying to become Marxists and realizing that there was never going to be a revolution of the proletariat, because with the Industrial Revolution that had occurred, the standard of living, particularly in Western civilization, so America and across Europe, was really good. Families had homes. They could, turn on their faucet and hot water came out. They could go to a grocery store and pick out multiple varieties of food. And so life was good, and the proletariat class was not rising up. And so in looking across the landscape, they effectively admitted failure with class struggle from an economics perspective, but they saw that the best way to change Western civilization came from Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian Marxist who said the only way to break down Western civilization was to destroy the church and the family. That was the bedrock of Western civilization. And so in putting together lots of writings and studying at the Frankfurt School, a lot of this nonsense, quite frankly, they said, we're going to have to get others, not the working class, but what is deemed on the fringes of society. is how they started. So Marcuse said that women were subjugated, that being a wife and a mother was not enough for women. And so this is where the feminist movement came in. And this is where he met a young man named Rudi Deuschke, who was younger. He also studied at the Frankfurt School. And as a college student, he had a talent for talking. I would compare him to a James Tallarico type, to be completely honest. You listen to him and you're like, oh, wow, yes, let's be good. But then
was it one of those things where it's like, oh, he's charismatic and it doesn't sound radical when he says it?
Yes, exactly that. This is Rudi Deuschke. And he actually is the one that coined the long march through the institutions. If we cannot have a revolution, a violent revolution, and convince society to overthrow leadership and become a classless society, then we need to take over the institutions that drive society, the thought-leading institutions. And that really focused on the ideas of going into our higher ed institutions, which set a lot of the culture, right? We know that culture affects politics. Politics is downstream from culture, is a common saying, but culture is downstream from education. So first they wanted to go into universities, and then into media, into Fortune 500 companies.
Right.
Into faith-based institutions. So what your dad was talking about is the admission from a leader in the Communist Party, Bella Dodd, who ended up testifying in front of Congress in the 50s about what she was involved in the 20s and 30s, which was to put communists. She publicly testified about putting communists into
seminaries.
She publicly testified about putting communists into the teachers' unions, the New York teachers' unions. She said between 1,000 and 1,500 that they put in there, which explains a lot right now.
Yeah.
And she did admit to many people and publicly, but not in that testimony, that they also did it in the church. So apparently she said that one of the faith leaders, one of the bishops, said, we don't want to talk about it being in the church because it will, cause some scandals, and we're trying to deal with it privately, which makes perfect sense. But yes, absolutely. And you did see this in the Catholic Church, where you had a lot of far leftist leaders and priests that were using some exegesis, is what I would say, and really distorting biblical values and scripture to align with a communist viewpoint. So the Long March through the Institutions, Rudi Deuschke is the one who coined it, working with Herbert Marcuse, and this was how they were going to take over some society from within our colleges of education, our medical schools, our thought leaders across America, as well as our business leaders, political leaders, and let that trickle down into society.
So let's walk this back to Marcuse. So this is at the Frankfurt School. So that means we're in Germany right now, which the other weird thing is, as I've been lately trying to sift through this and say, where do I start to try to understand this? It always comes back to Germany without a doubt. And sometimes I'm like, oh, is it Austria for some of it? No, it's just Germany. And
yes.
Why is that, Mandy?
Well, Germany and Italy, I would say, is a lot of it. But these are the fringes of Western civilization. When I say this, is when we can go back to Western civilization, the greatest civilization that's ever existed on the face of the earth, the origins coming out of the writings and principles from Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, the Old and New Testament, and working in concert, but also in tension with its kind of reason and revelation, right? And Western civilization has been able to do that better than any civilization that has ever existed, that balance. And so it led to excess, it led to prosperity, and it led to different classes, right? And so...
Well, actually, let's talk about that class real quick. Sorry to interrupt that.
Yeah.
But earlier you were talking about specifically that the proletariat wouldn't rise up.
Yeah.
And two different things on that. One is that I think now when leftists talk about more socialist things, they've changed their vocabulary a little bit. So you're not going to hear that as much. So just so people understand, what is the proletariat? Because I know for a long time, I even thought, oh, that meant the poor people of society.
Right.
That's not the case. So what class is that?
It's the working class. It's those...
It's really the middle class, isn't it?
Well, yes, we can call it middle class, the working middle class, those that get up every day and go to work to provide for their families. And so that is in Marx when he was talking. And let's also say, if we look at Marx's writings, both in in Capital and also the Communist Manifesto, he broke everything down into class struggle and it was taken as economics. However, he was really seeing society not just through economics. He explained it as, this is the scientific explanation of all class struggle throughout history. So he tried to incorporate science and history and saying this explains everything. And yes, from his view, there was an economics and cultural aspect of it. And that was in 1848 when he published the Communist Manifesto. And he's just a vile, foul man that if you research him, he really is. Yeah. It was just nasty, which explains why he rejected everything about society. He didn't bathe, he didn't work, he didn't do anything. And so he was like, this is not fair. And he said, like, you should be able to have all the food you want and be able to go to the theater. And that was his whole goal in life. And
it was go to the theater. I don't even think people talk about it.
It was so just so absurd. But my point is that people took that and they really kind of massaged around the edges for whatever that they deemed was wrong in society. So again, that was Marx. Then you go to Gramsci in Italy, and he was the leader of the Communist Party, right? And that was at the same time of Mussolini. So, fascists, which Mussolini, that was coined by his education minister named Giovanni Gentile. The term fascist, which was extreme nationalism coupled with nationalist control of effectively all aspects of society. Mm-hmm. So the production of all things needed in society. And so they basically, Mussolini, this leader that was a very skilled orator and writer, he was kind of a sickly man that, again, felt like he was on the fringes of society because he was small and sick and whatever. And he used that. He was thrown in prison. His famous prison notebooks were utilized by the Frankfurt School in 1923. It was started by a Marxist named Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. And there was like 4 of them, and Marcuse was one of them. It was a playwright, a sociologist, a psychologist, and I don't know, a crazy person. And they started this, and it was really kind of laughed at. It was not seen as a respectable place. The only person that became respected and well known out of it was Herbert Marcuse. And I talked about this in the speech. So he took Marx and he took Gramsci and he took all the, musings and whining of those that are like victimhood class, which is where we are, he explains where we are now. And he loved it and promoted it. But the problem for him was, this was also, the Frankfurt School was started in 23, but then there was the rise of Hitler, not long after that. And Marcuse was a secular Jew. And that was not going to work out well in Germany. And so he fled to America, the land of the free, where we support religious freedom and freedom of speech. And he went first to Columbia, then he went out to California universities, then he was at Harvard for a short stint. But he really promoted and delivered this idea of Marxism, but for cultural revolutionary purposes. So not necessarily for economic revolution purposes, but for cultural purposes. And this caught on. This caught on our campuses. And then that's when he met Deutschke, who they coined this idea that we're not going to get the classes, the proletariat, working class, to rise up against the bourgeois, the owner class, to do this, but we can get women. And then they said women and urban dwellers in the urban areas. And sometimes they referred.
And what year are we at this point now?
In this year, so Marcuse he came over in the 30s. Okay. But it was 30 years worth of work. Mm-hmm. When he met Deutschke, you're looking at the 60s now. Okay. So he's been bouncing around colleges thought leading institutions and kind of trying to figure out how to push this idea. But it was really that partnership with Deutsche that they developed the long march to the institutions of let's infiltrate them and take them over. And this is important when we're talking about education, because it's the same time as the rise of a Brazilian Marxist named Paulo Freire. If you don't know who Paulo Freire is, he wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is one of the most utilized pedagogical sources in our colleges of education here in America and across the world. And this is where you're getting a lot of this dialectical critique, critical theory, if you will, in the pedagogical process. It was no longer about exchanging or delivering information to students. It was this dialectical experience of looking at everything through the lens, including with your students, right? Everything about society, even math. That you're looking at it through the critical lens to critique it from an oppressed versus oppressor mindset. Again, that's where it's all derived from Marxism. That is the genus. But then when we look at all the different critical theories, critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical whatever theory, I mean, it just keeps going. This is where it's coming from. It all is derived from the genus of Marx. These are just the offshoots or the species, if you will.
And the beginning for this march to the institutions, like you were saying, it's like he starts speaking at universities.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting even which universities you're mentioning, because these were ones that were already prestigious at the time. That's right. And that's where, like you were saying, these larger companies are sourcing from. That's where even government institutions are sourcing from.
Yeah.
And that also trickles down into lower levels of education.
Yes.
And I'm trying to remember in Russia at the same time, because they're type of communism is just slightly different, but same overall thing.
Yeah,
just different view of humanity.
Right.
Yeah. But I'm trying to remember if I think it was Lenin's wife who had was a school teacher herself and was part of the movement and saying like, okay, well, we need to bring these ideas into the schools. Like we need to bring them into these lower levels. So it seems like that's also part of the idea. That's at least that was at least intended in America as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that became very clear. There are different models, and we can talk about the Prussian model of education, which is arguably what our system in some ways was built.
And you said the oppression model of education? Or
the Prussian.
The Prussian,
but
sorry,
it is basically oppression and victimhood nonsense.
So wait, what is that model?
But to bring them in and effectively indoctrinate them to serve the state. So yes, lots of people realized, and this is what we're saying right now, realize that to capture a civilization, you need to capture the next generation and train them up in the mindset. So I'll point to two others that are really important, and this spreads against the span of history in modern history, which is Giovanni Gentile, the father of fascism, a Marxist, if you will, a extreme nationalist Marxist. That is effectively what fascism is. I know that now people say it's a far right-wing ideology. It is not. That is just a revision of history by Marxists to say, oh no, that looked a lot like Hitler, who was killing millions of people, and that looked a lot like Lenin, so we can't do that. We can't call it that. But it's just revisionist history by Marxists and Western civilization. But Giovanni Gentile is the founder of fascism, and he and Mussolini, threw this gentleman, Antonio Gramsci, into prison because he was a political threat. And Gentile said to Mussolini, make me your education minister. They knew. He said, make me your education minister. And he said, the schools are the battleground and the children's minds are the prize. And so, yes, that ties into what Lenin was set with his wife. You have to go in. And it also ties into, there's a famous, I think it was 1984, interview with a former KGB propaganda minister, whatever he was, and he came here, Yuri Brezmenov is his name, and I encourage people to go watch the interview. But he gave an interview in the 80s saying it was just building off of all of this Marxist ideology, that the KGB's plan was 4 steps to take over the West. So similar to the church and the family, they said the way to do this was first demoralization, which is demoralizing students. And they said it would take about 17 years, which lo and behold, that's roughly the amount of time that kids are in the K through 12 system. And you can teach them effectively to hate themselves and to hate what they stand for, to hate who they are, to put them down, to hate Western civilization, to hate America. But they said, the KGB said, it was already in action because the feminist movement and this Marxist cultural revolution that they had already started was already in play, and kids were already being told to hate America. Their history books were already being changed, and we're facing this right now, to talk about the transatlantic slave trade like that's the only slavery that existed, whereas we know slavery has existed since time immemorial.
Right.
And so, but not wanting to talk about the fact that it was different African tribes that were stealing people to put them into slave trade. In fact, at the State Board of Education meetings here, while we're revising our history, social studies and history teaks, it's really important. Some of there was a few Marxists who were in the working groups, and they wanted to talk about a lot about the transatlantic slave trade, this really awful time in American history that we absolutely need to educate children on to understand the horrors of what went on. But they said, we don't want to talk about the origins. They literally wrote it out. We do not want to talk about the origins. We do not want to include that it was different African tribes that were conquering and capturing and selling other African, because it might be distressing. And so that's just one example now.
That might be distressing, but talking about the rest of the slave trade wouldn't be.
Correct.
But also that doesn't mean that you shouldn't educate people on it if it's part of history.
That's right. But that's kind of the point, is it is revisionist history. They are they are using history to try and demoralize, which then goes to the second part of the KGB, which was after demoralization, it was destabilization. So you look around at what's gone on for, 75 years. We can talk about Weatherford, the Weather Underground cabal. That's Bill Ayers and...
I was going to ask, what is that one? I'm not familiar.
Okay, so they were a radical Marxist communist group that called for violent revolution, violent overthrow of America.
What era is this that we're talking about?
So we're talking about them. They started 60s again.
Okay.
But they published this famous book called Prairie Fire that they passed through, you didn't have email and stuff, but it was like coffee shops and talking on university campuses and things like that. And it called for violent revolution. And they also committed a lot of terrorist attacks. And you may have heard about one of the leaders named Bill Ayers when Obama was running for president. Bill Ayers claims to have ghostwritten Dreams of My Father. Whether that's true or not, but we definitely know that there was some sort of relationship there. And they were part of the Weather Underground, just Marxists that wanted to use violence, murdering people, which is what Marxists do. You can call it any other name, fascist, communist, social, whatever. But ultimately, the idea is that you got to break some eggs to make an omelet, in theory. And so, yes, murdering people through starvation, like the Holodomor or gulags, or just executing them, or gas chambers, that it's all justified to create this society of which the state is ultimately God, and that everyone is atheist and there is no higher power, and therefore we submit to whomever the leader would be. In Marx's case, he set it up where it would be him and Engels, his partner. They were the leader of the Communist Party at that time, and it would be them. So you just insert, but it's all the same thing. It's all the same theory, and you can take that all the way up to, again, Obama, where he said he wanted to fundamentally transform America, and he meant it. He was soaked in the Marxist ideology all through his education system. And what we're watching right now is our children, American children, that are in our classrooms being seeped in this radical, revolutionary, cultural revolution, whether it's class or gender or economics or immigration status or anything. And you see this play out in No Kings protests and ICE protests and No Wall Street protests and Code Pink protests and all of these things. They are all one and the same. That intersectionality movement that came from Kimberly Crenshaw, who, of course, studied Marx in our education system. So it all comes back. And so the Long March was ultimately to embed as many people in education, in medicine. When we've had this conversation, what is a woman, which is so bizarre for the past 5 to 8 years.
Right.
Human beings have known what a woman is since the beginning of time. This is an intentional dialectic deconstruction of nature, human nature, but also the laws of nature, and nature is God. And so they are deconstructing that, and that's what they are doing. And they are using our education systems, not just higher ed, the colleges of education, the colleges of medicine, history, math became racist in California a few years ago. It was just nuts.
Right.
But
or even like taking SAT scores differently for different
yes,
people.
it's like it's that everything, there is no truth. And that's where you hear language, my truth, his truth, her truth. There's truth. There's truth. There are some things that just, are axiomatic and we all know what they are, and it just is what it is. But that's not what all of this is built off of. It is all built off of critical thinking, critical theories, which all, again, go back in history to Frankfurt School and Marcuse, to Gramsci, to Mussolini, to Marx.
The outsprings or outspurts of all of these movements, it depends on when it lands, and then it takes off from there. So it got to Europe first, and then we see Europe being progressively a few decades ahead of the US. So we can look over there and be like, wow, that's where we're going to end up if we don't change
things. It's a disaster over there.
Same thing with Latin America, ends up in Latin America, spreads out differently as well. Same kind of getting people to believe in the victimhood status. And now you have someone like Claudia Scheinbaum in charge of Mexico, who also studied at Berkeley.
It all goes together. I mean, you can see it all.
And then in America, though, you were saying Marcuse, when did he come to America? In the 20s or 30s?
It was about the 30s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then 60. So did it take, I guess, that 3 decades for then in the 60s just to be the right set of circumstances for all these other movements to come out of?
Yeah.
Because I want to go down that line of what happens in the 60s, because in between the 30s and 60s, it didn't seem to be as popular in America to have these socialist ideologies. Well,
there was. Okay. And so this is why I say you had the McCarthyism and the trials and the constitutional testimonies that we talked about. That was in the 50s. But that was because this was this underground network that was in mostly the thought-leading institutions. So we're talking about.
But I guess they go public then in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, it was public on college campuses.
Okay.
And this is where you were getting, and let's be honest, at that point, you're having kids from mostly middle and upper middle class and well off. That's who was going to colleges at that point. And they're very susceptible as you're trying to figure out life, but you're still on your parents' tab, and you've never paid taxes, and you never actually worked, and you don't have children. And so you don't know that biological innate drive to protect them, provide for them, and prepare them to launch into the world to whatever their purpose is. They're calling from God. Why are they here? And so you don't have that. And so you get people who they believe, and this is very true now, they believe that they are educating you to do what is right. And they believe that they have this expanded view of pluralism, this weaponization, if you will, of our constitutional rights, the Bill of Rights, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And they kind of tweak and pervert things, much like, again, a James Tallarico and so many of these other really progressive pastors that are looking more about validating people as opposed to educating them about biblical values and what's expected, the moral boundaries and expectations from God. They're willing to change it with the times, and that's what you saw in higher ed then, and you see it now. So that's what was going on, but it hadn't really trickled out necessarily into society because, again, well, of course, we had World War II in that opinion. And so that was, people had to come together. You had to fight against the National Socialists, which is the Nazis. And so you had a lot of American pride. So it did not infest society completely. But at that point, you were seeing a shift in K through 12 because the teachers' unions, starting in New York, but this has branched out everywhere, were inundated and infiltrated with avowed communists. Nowadays, you have the Democratic Socialists of America that are passing out flyers and pamphlets saying why you should become a teacher. I mean, this was part of the strategy, is how do we get to the children to indoctrinate them, to demoralize them, to hate who they are, hate their country, question their parents, question their God, and question society, and then destabilize them, protest, 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 protest. You were seeing that in the 60s and the 70s, and you started seeing that. The next step, I was talking about Yuri Bezmenov. The next step after demoralization and destabilization is a crisis. And they have tried to spark, the Marxists have ultimately tried to spark crisis or wars, infighting for decades. Again, I talk about the Weather Underground, who were setting off bombs. You can go back to the Oklahoma City bomber. You can go to Charles Manson, for goodness sake. He was trying to create a race war. Like, you go and they're trying to create some sort of crisis. I would say you can see it now. The woman at the ICE protest that drove towards a ICE officer and he shot her, because if you point a car at an officer of the law, that's what they're trained to do, that, as they should. You can't try and kill somebody.
And not to be conspiratorial, but I'm thinking about the way that lockdowns happen and the types of procedures that have gone down during COVID.
Lockdowns with COVID, no King's protests. They're always looking for some sort of crisis to spark this revolution. And so that is the third step, is first it's demoralization, second is destabilization, then a crisis, some sort of flashpoint that you can get everybody to be angry. George Floyd protests. A drug addict criminal that was on fentanyl and dying and behaving bizarre because he was on fentanyl, not complying. And this sparked nationwide, worldwide riots. And so, yes, that's what they're trying to look for, because ultimately, if you can create that crisis, it opens the door for a change. Lenin did it. Mao did it. If you can create that, then you come in, you start to stabilize, and you create the new normal. And that's where you go from destabilization or demoralization. You hate who you are. You hate your culture. Western civilization is who they want you to hate. God, family, freedom, all the things that we enjoy. You destabilize, protest, anger, protest, anger, shots, all of this stuff. Then you have some sort of flashpoint crisis, a murder, something. And then they come in, they swoop in as the government, they save the day, and then you have the new normal, which is all of the government control. And yes, a lot of people point to the COVID shutdowns as that attempt, and they did. They remember it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and then it became this criminal Fauci on our screens every day saying, just trust us, just trust us, just trust us. And you go back and you look at it and you're just going, this was government control, whether people realized it or not, of attempting to normalize the government being able to tell you to wear useless masks, stay 6 feet away from people.
And
somehow,
I think the silver lining is the only, I guess, unintended consequence for them was for the first time parents now had access to seeing their kids' classrooms.
Nailed it.
And that was, I think, something that they weren't expecting to be a backlash from that.
Miss Jones, who looked real nice on Meet the Parent night, has trans flag hiding behind her, and she's reading her book, which happens in Austin ISD. She's reading your first grader the book, My Shadow is Purple, which is a transgender ideology book to indoctrinate children, 7-year-olds, to think that they can change their gender, which is obviously scientifically untrue. But yes, this is exactly what happened. They started hearing readings where it was hatred of society. They were breaking up kids into the oppressed and the oppressor. We saw, teachers doing lessons on by separating kids into the color of their skin, the color of their hair. We heard a lot about privilege walks. This is actually privilege walks comes from, if you're not familiar with that, that's where you line kids up on the baseline of the basketball court or the football field, and you ask them a series of questions. Again, this is where you're doing this dialectical critique, antithesis and synthesis, and it just kind of rolls. And you're saying, do you have 2 parents? If so, take 2 steps forward. Did they go to college? If so, take 2 steps forward. Do you live in a house, not an apartment? Take 2 steps forward. Did you that kind of stuff.
And it's separating people, and now you see,
right. And then you say, turn around. That's the victims, the oppressed class versus the victors, the oppressors, and this mentality of somehow because your parents stayed together and made that choice to get married and have children within wedlock, that somehow you have done something wrong. And so it is this demoralizing tactic that we've seen, and more parents saw it, and they're fighting back. But as much as we try and chop off the tree, maybe we see a stump and we think, oh, it's gone. Every week we turn around. We just saw it recently at UNT, where there is, one of the staff members talking about how, yes, we still have DEI in here, kind of whisper. We still have DEI here. We just don't call it that. We just change the coursework.
I know some teachers in Bastrop County, and they were talking about, there's a new administrator, and it's not a DEI position, but it's a DEI position.
Right. So you see this, it's everywhere. So we might chop it off and get down and think, okay, we've eliminated that invasive species, if you will. Yeah. But the truth is the roots are still there, and they are wide, and they are
gardening. You can't get rid of the weeds.
That's right. That is exactly right.
There's I know that we could go on about how this then went into the sexual revolution and all of those connections, but it seems like at all of these stages, the main thing is discord. So when feminism comes about, it's separating men from women. Whenever you're talking about even things like the transgender stuff, it's even pitting kids against their parents, and that you're separating them from each other. And it seems to me that all of those steps are so you can't trust each other and your neighbors, and the only one you can look to is government.
That is right.
Is that the ultimate goal here?
That is the ultimate goal, and that is what critical theory is. To be clear, this is exactly what critical theory is. Yes, and it ultimately goes back to, again, Marx, who called religion the opiate of the masses, right? But then Gramsci, who said the only way to destroy Western civilization and the freedoms that we have, which is a repulsion, a rejection of absolute government control, is to destroy faith and the family. I mean, yes, that is ultimately what it is to break the bonds, break the ties with parents, and do anything you can to demoralize and destabilize that bond, that relationship, but also with religion. And this is really important for people to understand. We have freedom of religion, freedom of religion. Our founders who fled from England, the majority of them, did not want to have state control of a religion. And they said, you want to be free. And a lot of times people, in fact, the argument for having Supreme Court cases that have systematically removed religion from the public square was a letter from Thomas Jefferson, who basically said a wall of separation of church and state. And he was writing that to Danbury Baptist Church, who said, we're a little bit concerned about the government coming in and infringing upon our religious freedom, how we practice as Baptists. And he said, no. What we meant is that there is a wall of separation between church and state, meaning there's a wall blocking the state from inserting themselves into your religious practices and things like that. But what it has been perverted by a lot of left-wing radical justices is freedom of religion has become freedom from religion. And we've watched this battle play out right now over the past year, really. We passed a new chronological history standards for the state of Texas. It's the first in the country. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's obvious. It's teaching history in a chronological spiraling method. I'm using my hands because you're going back and you're touching on what has occurred in history. You're telling the total picture of history to students so that they have a full understanding of the why. Why were decisions made? Why is the Magna Carta so important? The Magna Carta limited the power and basically established that kings were not the ultimate authority. There was a higher authority, which plays into our Declaration of Independence, laws of nature, and nature is God. That there is a higher authority and that they are subject to that higher authority and the laws of the land. That is huge. That never existed in society before. If you didn't like what a king was doing or if you whatever, you were going to have to overthrow him, kill him, whatever. But that was it. So that was a big step. And that was in 1215. So a lot of people try and say, oh, the Enlightenment is what developed Western civilization. No, it wasn't. That was hundreds of years later.
Right.
Built off of the premise of the values that come, again, out of the Old New Testament, Jerusalem, as well as Athens and Rome. And that is so important. We have to talk about that. It is important for kids to understand that piece of history, along with what's gone on in antiquity, but then how that impacted, in 1630, the Mayflower Compact, where they were coming for the glory of God, and why they came over here. Why our founders wrote the Declaration of Independence talking about God, mentioning him 4 different times. This was a foundational belief, and ultimately it's the foundational belief that led to restriction of government. George Washington was an Orthodox Christian by all accounts. I mean, he referenced God. He believed in the Holy Trinity. He declined becoming a king, which King George said, if that is true, he is the greatest man that's ever existed in the world. And so, but we have Marxists at our State Board of Education that are trying to call George Washington a terrorist. This man was a Christian who believed the overarching authority was God. And that's why they set up separation of church and state, separation of powers, did not want to be a king, all these other aspects of the way that our government and our founding documents are set up. So I'm saying that because at the State Board of Education and throughout history, any mention of, in particular, Christianity makes secular Marxists that have infiltrated our education system fight back and say, you can't have religion, you can't have religion. Well, you can't understand Western civilization. You cannot appreciate or understand our system of government, our standards of morality, any aspect of the way that America operates and our greatness if you don't understand the primary sources that were referenced to develop, again, all of our founding documents, our founding fathers, and how that we operate today. So they fight, and they fight really, really hard. And I think that parents and patriots need to understand we are in a cultural revolution. This is exactly what Marx called for. It's exactly what so many radicals have called for, where they have co-opted our education system. They demoralize our kids to think that being an American is not good. They have convinced kids. I think the Cato Institute released recent studies showing that it was upwards of 60% of people under the age of 40 support the idea of communism.
Wow.
Yeah, it's horrifying.
Wow.
You're seeing all this come out, and it occurred because of the long march through the institutions, because they circumvent the constitutional republic framework that was put in place by our founders, who were incredibly wise. And they use the administrative state, and they have captured the culture. and they have captured our education system. And patriots have got to fight back. They have to be just as aggressive. You have got to call them what they are. They are Marxists at heart. They are not kind-hearted people. They want God out and the state in. And to be clear, this has been tried. This has been tried dozens of times throughout the world and has murdered, starved, executed, gassed somewhere between 100 and 200 million people in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. You die. You die under this system unless you are the elite of the elite. And even if you're the elite of the elite, if you're like Lenin, who used to just pick out people to have them executed in his own hierarchy, Stalin did this as well, Mao does this as well, just to send a signal to everyone else. I don't care who you are and how powerful you are, if I even think that you are threatening my power. Because to them, they are the gods. If you are threatening my power, I will kill you. And that is what happens. And they will do it indiscriminately. They do not care who you are. They will murder you. And that is what Marxism ultimately leads to. And that is what these revolutionaries, no matter how kind they claim they're being, that is what they are walking us. They are marching us into unless we fight back.
It seems to me that they've had this plan, this strategy for a long time now. They've continued to move forward with their plan. How do we combat that system that has seemed to succeed in many ways?
Yeah.
And is there hope?
There is hope. There is hope. So we built the Parent Empowerment Coalition here in Texas. It is tens of thousands of parents that they get it. They see it. And patriots, I should say, they get it and they see it. That was the importance of passing school choice. Get your kids out of the public schools that are participating in this radical nonsense, whether it's providing chest binders for transgender ideology indoctrination, whether it's privilege walks for class struggle indoctrination, whatever it is. Yes, there is hope. SB 37, which was passed by then Senator Creighton, now Chancellor Creighton, is a great bill. I really, really hope to see. We should FedSoc the entire education system, but in particular, we should FedSoc the colleges of education.
You're talking about the Federalist Society?
Yes, the Federalist Society. Yeah. Yes. Well, they saw the long march to the institutions had taken hold in the legal institution and the law school. And so they said, we're going to create an alternative path, an alternative association. And now I think 5 of our 9
So
Supreme
basically
Court
what we're
justices.
doing is we're breaking the monopoly that the left has had over our institutions for
That's right.
decades.
That's it. And you have to fight back. I know as particularly as Christians, a lot of times we don't want to engage, or we don't want to be called mean or Christian nationalists, right? We don't want to feel like we are pushing our values on others. And so we tend to turn the other cheek, no matter how ugly other people are, no matter how dangerous their ideology is. We want to pretend like it's not happening. It's not that bad. It is that bad. It is absolutely that bad. Many of them are willing to engage in violence, as we see routinely throughout society. But I say that it is a calling. If you know that God is the ultimate authority, you are being called upon to fight back in this cultural revolution that is trying to eliminate him from all aspects of society. You are called to pick up your sling and your smooth pebbles and fire. And that is what we have to do. You do not look at someone that is clearly a danger to your children, to America, and say, I'm going to turn the other cheek. I'm going to ignore the Goliath over there. You fight back. You do it with truth, and you do it with confidence. Because, look, America is a baby. We're coming up on 250 years. But if you look at societies, civilizations throughout history, once you start demoralizing, once you start allowing those that do not want to, that don't appreciate or understand the values of which you were built upon, once you don't force outsiders to assimilate to your cultural values that have built you, that's when you start seeing the destruction of civilizations. And so we're really at a tipping point where it is time for patriots to say no more. I will not let radical Marxist ideology, these critical theories in my child's classroom. It's time for higher ed to say we're getting all of these critical theories out of all aspects of higher ed. This is not about academic freedom, which is what the Marxists always try and hide behind while taxpayer dollars are paying for it. Nope, not happening. Out you go. And it's time to push back against those that believe that you can create utopia on earth. That's what Marx thought, that you would progress to this, like
to the end of history.
To the end of history, when we all just, wear, I guess, ugly brown jumpsuits like Kim Jong-il and eat bread and go to the theater for our circus or whatnot. But that is ultimately what they want, and whether they realize that that's what they're advocating for or not. And we have to fight back. We have to understand who these people are, and that no matter how many books they write, no matter how nice they sound, they are bad people, and you have to fight back against bad people, because if you don't, we will go the way that we have seen in less than 100 years, where you get a charismatic leader, a Hitler type, that has created so much demoralization among society, so much distrust, so much tension, so much hatred. And you will see the breakdown. We are seeing the breakdown of families and our culture. And this revolution will come to fruition, and we will not have the freedoms. Not just in America, we are the protectors of the free world. The free world will not have the freedoms. So it is time to fight back against those that seek to destroy Western civilization, subvert the will of the people, which is to be free, and say, we're not teaching our children this. We're not allowing our colleges of education, any of our university systems to perpetuate this nonsense. Call it what it is and kick it out. No matter how mean it is, fire them all. I don't care if they live under a bridge, in a box. If you are pushing this into our kids' brains, you have to go find a job in the free market. They don't, because they can't, because the majority of people actually appreciate the standards of living of capitalism and the freedoms that Western civilization, particularly the American Constitution, delivered.
Well, Mandy, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. And if people want to keep up with the work that we're doing at the Texas Public Policy Foundation to make sure that Texas and America are the freest places on earth, you can visit texaspolicy.com. And I will see all of you guys next time.